Hi, yes, thanks for the introduction. Wow, hi. Really happy to be here tonight. So, my name is Anton. I'm a researcher here at SCS Software. I work primarily on the game American Truck Simulator. And today I'm going to be talking about environmental storytelling and, yeah, just about it. So, let's plunge directly into it. And I'd like to begin by saying that environmental storytelling is a little bit of a joke or a meme at this time, and that's because most of the instances of environmental storytelling that people usually talk about are kind of self-explanatory. So, like you've got examples like a game portal where you can see on the walls little bits of information that tell us something about the story or the game world, and basically this is how we learn about what's happening in the game world. Then we have games like The Last of Us, where there are like little objects that we can interact with. And these objects are also somehow creating like an impression of what's going on, or perhaps it's telling us something about other people that live in that environment, and they basically create stories. And then you've got like different assets, 3D models that are somehow telling of what's going on in the game, right? And a great example of this is a game Horizon Zero Dawn. So these instances are really self-explanatory, and because of that, they aren't telling us much about what environmental storytelling is and how we can think of it in order to make greater games. Which is why I would like to suggest to think about storytelling in more abstract terms. And that is by saying that a narrative is a structure. So what does it mean? It means that every kind of narrative, every kind of story can be represented as an abstraction. It can be represented as a structure. And as an example, we can take a look at the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. And this myth can be mediated in a variety of ways. It can be a story told in language. It can be a film or a painting. In each case, we've got the same structure underlining what's going on, right? So if we look at this diagram here, we can say that at the beginning there is just one character, Daedalus, who says that, okay, I'm going to invent a set of wings and fly away. Then he asks his son to, like he does that, and together with his son, they're flying away. And so this is like a second event. And the third event of the narrative, the son decides to fly close to the sun, his wings burn down, and he falls down and dies. And in the end, we have like the first event where we are left just with one character, Daedalus, who's at the beginning of it. So this structure, it's an abstraction, right? And it is somehow fundamentally present in each case, in each mediation of the story. So what does it mean for us? It means that narratives, since they're structures, they can basically create meanings. Let me illustrate this idea on those two examples. So here in the example number one, we have a set of geometrical figures that do not mean anything in themselves. They are just figures. Once we introduce sequence to this random collection of items, we can now impose different narrative structures on it and derive meaning from it. For example, we can say that the yellow circle is moving through the blue square. And as it's moving, it gets bigger. And because of that, we can already say that this can be a metaphor of experience, right? So for example, we say that this blue square represents a challenge or a major life event, right? Or like a boss in a game. And the yellow circle is a player or a person. And as they go through that challenge, they grow bigger, they develop, and they change, right? So this is an example of how an abstract narrative structure can influence the way we perceive objects. Let me provide you with another example that is more pertinent to game development. So this is a game called Loneliness, and you can play it on Steam. And this game is based on a very simple kind of mechanics. the only kind of input that you have here is movement. And you play as this little dot here. And as you approach other little dots, they either disappear or move away from you, right? And because the title of the game is loneliness, we can now see that this kind of interaction represents a variety of things, right? Or we can read it metaphorically in a variety of ways. So it means that even though the only thing that we can see on the screen are one kind of geometrical figures, the action, the visual material, has a lot of narrative potential. And sometimes it is enough to use very little assets or very little game development capacities that have a lot of narrative potential in order to complete a game. So this game uses a limited number of game elements, but it still succeeds at creating gameplay, right? And this is a finished product. As we move on to more complex games, there are more elements of a game that we can use to create a sense of narrativity or create those narrative structures. For example, in a game called Journey, the game mechanics are also very limited. And just as in case with Loneliness, your basic input is movement. So this is a game that seeks to represent the experience of going through a deserted space. And and this is basically like everything you can do in the game. But instead, it uses colors to communicate emotional meaning, so communicate emotional information. And it has different levels that are designed using different color schemes. And this is how it introduces variability to the gameplay. Another example is a game called Grease, which is similar to Journey in that regard, but it also uses music. So it uses color and music to communicate emotional information, right? And different kinds of geometrical shapes. And this is basically because the game is about difficult feelings of loss and grief. And we learned that it is about that not through any direct statements or conversations or some of the more traditional ways of storytelling, but we learn about it solely through interacting with the musical and the color elements of the game. And in our game, we use 3D assets, 3D models, in order to create scenes that also communicate some kind of information, right? And which is which is understandable, like for games that are created in a 3D space. And so we use these assets, we use these 3D models to create a sense of eventhood, right? And create these scenes that are somehow more than just themselves. At this point, I would like to suggest a definition of narrativity and how it relates to game, and a definition that would also be pertinent to the examples I've just talked about. And I know that there's a lot of text now on the screen. Please, I would like to read those two statements now, so please bear with me because there will be more. Or maybe if anybody wants to read it, I will be glad for, no? Okay. I mean, you can still have the chance, guys. All right, so let's read these two statements one by one and think about them for a moment, right? And then there will be more examples. So we can say that narrativity can be defined as an additional layer of meaning that can be derived from a representation. Okay. Let's process that, okay? And the second statement is that narrativity occurs when the representation signifies more than what it contains, when the represented objects signify more than what they contain, when representation communicates additional meanings apart from those included into it. So what does it really mean? Before elaborating on those two statements, I would like to talk a little bit about, I'd like to make a little diversion and talk a little bit about representation itself. And I'd like to do that by showing you a reference from an American state that we are currently working on, creating a DLC representing that state. And our map designers are really great at representing the reality that they see in a very detailed way. And this is basically one of the oldest art techniques that is used in art, which is mimesis, which is representation, right? And this is basically copying of reality. And we as human beings, because we are pattern-seeking animals, we take delight in seeing how the similarities can be skillfully and artfully recreated. And because of that, this in itself is already an art form. But what happens when we start to create our representation, when we start to create our artistic output based not on the real reference, but on imagination, when we start to throw in some random suggestions and allusions, and when our goal is not to copy reality as close as possible, but maybe to create a representation that is more based on imagination and that is more loose in that regard. The result is that we unlock the narrative potentiality. And I like this image in particular, which is also a screenshot from American Truck Simulator, because it shows how the objects that you see, they are not just about the silo and the farm and the old car here, but they also tell us something about what it feels like to be in America, and perhaps what it feels like to be an American farmer. And this is exactly what I'm talking about, because this image, even though it is a representation of reality, it has a narrative potential in itself, and it allows us to invest all those additional cultural meanings into it, even though everything we see here are just objects. So there is nothing here that directly tells us a story, but it kind of has this structural vacant point where we can invest a story, which is based on our cultural knowledge. Let me illustrate this idea using another example. So here is, this screen is another swampy area that we've photographed researching a new state for ATS. And this here is a screenshot from a well-known game, Red Dead Redemption, right? And it's like the two things aren't related. As you know, in Red Dead Redemption, they rather create imaginary spaces, and it's like in an imaginary state, which is like a collage of most typical types of American landscape. But there's a kind of correlation here, right? And this is because this swamp here is based on an imaginary idea of a swamp, right? So already at this moment, it represents not just a piece of reality, but something more. It represents a particular cultural entity, a particular cultural phenomenon. And once game designers are capable of doing that, this can affect the affordances of the game. Simply put, this can affect the type of content that we can put into our game. So because this is like a kind of swampy area and it's all suggestive, you know, of the American ghost story traditions and like, you know, scary things happening on the swamp, the game designers at Rockstar put all those kind of assets there, and they even have a mission where you have like to deal with a ghost, basically, right? And this is only possible because the narrative potential of a real reference has been unlocked. And once it has been unlocked, it allowed to explore all those game affordances and to basically verify and enlarge the types of things that are included into the game, and that the game, like the things that a gamer can experience and can actually do in the game. So this kind of cultural information is everywhere, and the world is saturated with it. A good example of how this information is transmitted, of how it's translated, is films. And here, for example, is another references we saw on the road. And this is just the White House. So there's nothing in it that suggests a sense of drama in itself, because this is just a place where people live. But it is evocative of some of the visuals from American movies, like, for example, Forrest Gump here. And we can use it in a variety of ways. Another example is this tree standing in the middle of a field that is not as closely, but still I would argue that is quite pertinent to this famous scene from the Shawshank Redemption. And basically by these things, they are like everywhere. Getting back to the example with the swamp, here are other two examples. One above is a reference that we found researching a state, and the reference below is a screenshot from Red Dead Redemption. And so those are like swamp areas, and they have this particular, all those connotations, because in American literature and American culture there's been this great story of ghost story. There's been this great tradition of ghost stories represented by people like Edgar Allan Poe or Lovecraft, who actually wrote a story called The Dark Swamps. And it is exactly about what Rockstar included into their game. It's about this person who comes to a swamp and then strange creatures kill them. Right? I mean, Rockstar doesn't have that, but they explored that cultural affordance that was in the air, and they just picked up on that. They were able to identify it, and they turned that narrative potential in a very tangible content that they actually included inside the game. So, and this is basically how it works. By combining the real reference with an external cultural meaning, you can turn it into what can be called narrativity. And I realized that perhaps narrativity here is not still the best term, because it presupposes a temporal development of events. Yet, it basically corresponds to that idea that a narrative structure imposed on a representation can impart eventhood and characterhood onto it. And it can generate meanings that are not otherwise present in this context. And so this is basically what we do at SCS when we try to develop landscapes that are not basing representation of reality, but also an exploration of broader cultural meanings. Because when we turn a landscape into a representation, we endow it with cultural significance and make it a part of a broader context and a broader tradition. And doing that, it is important to be able to identify and see those narrative potentials and explore them in a way that is more intricate and more complex than some of the more traditional storytelling devices, like the ones I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, because in the end, this is what's going to create ambiguity. And ambiguity is crucial here, because ambiguity makes the player to always want to come back to your game and relive it again and again. And because when we see something, we can either understand it completely and then lose our interest, or we can like have a sense that we understand it, but not really. And in that case, it can be a success, because then the player comes back to your game and spends a lot of time by going through the same content, basically. So this means that this kind of representation, this kind of work with narrativity can actually generate more meanings with the help of fewer assets. So here are some of the references that I've used preparing for this presentation. I would particularly recommend taking a look at the book called Story and Discourse by Seymour Chapman. and this book here called Game Poems, and I think that this one you can actually download for free from the writer's website, and also some of the GDC talks that I have found really inspirational. And if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them, and thank you very much for your attention.